and we are recording. Hi, folks. Hi, everybody. Jimmy, I think we'll get going at this point. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds good. We have everyone in from the waiting room, 32 participants.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. It is a tremendous honor to open up our overview effect lecture series with Lydia Calapoliti. My name is Ed Keller. I'm the co-director with Carlo Leitao of the Postplanetary Universal Design Program at the New Center. I'm also a creative director for this year's Space and Planetary Design track with the Venice Biennale, the Architecture Biennale. This is part of the Italian Pavilion under the curation of Alessandro Mellis and the Italian Virtual Pavilion under the curation of Tom Kovac. So many, many thanks to Alessandro and Tom and their teams and the brilliant designers and thinkers who've joined this extended series of exhibitions, events, lectures, symposia, and performances which the CityX Venice and Italian Virtual Pavilion are making possible. It is a slightly different format from perhaps other architecture biennales in the sense that there's a giant network of people who've been convened by Alessandro, Tom, and a group of about 22 creative directors from around the world. The Overview Effect Lecture Series is the first in a set of talks that I'm putting together this summer and fall underneath the track Space and Planetary Design. It's positioned as a survey of some of the key operational themes that are critical to what we could call post-planetary and universal design. We're bringing together an architect, engineer, historian, an AI developer, mathematician, philosopher, a science fiction author and marine biologist, and a transdisciplinary geographer and ecologist to engage the question of how disciplinary boundaries can be effectively and critically reshaped towards a universal modality of design thinking. So our guest speakers over the next 2 weeks are today Lydia Calapoliti, tomorrow Ben Goertzel, and next week Peter Watts and Stephanie Wakefield. We will have special guests. Fred Sharman will join us as a discussant today with Lydia. The New School Policy and Design for Outer Space group will be joining us tomorrow with Ben Goertzel. David Roden next week for Peter Watts, and more to be confirmed. A special thanks to Jimmy Hagan, who's joining us today as a co-host. He will also join the discussions over the next 2 weeks, and he will be organizing a series of workshops and sessions later in the year as part of the Space and Planetary Design track. So thank you so much, Jimmy, for joining us. A couple of words on post-planetary and universal design thinking. What are we working on by thinking through these terms and the implications they bring up? As architects, urbanists, infrastructural designers, system thinkers, economists, ecologists, AI developers, artists, we navigate and negotiate with the intertwined webs of human energy, expenditure, and information flow, and their impacts on civilization and all species on Earth. The challenge is to envision new configurations at the edge of our planetary comfort zone. For example, architecture's conception of itself as a discipline has depended for centuries on a model of the artificial in relation to the natural and the primal human action in the wilderness, to build a hut or make a bonfire. This tension between codex of preservation or rituals of conflagration also configures the very base of organic and planetary life and the negative entropies of design. Thus, design becomes potentially a radically temporalized act. It can function as an amplifier or attenuator for the planetary broad spectrum codex of our historical, material, organic, and socio-technical configurations. Our life world and our built environments operate across a deep arc of temporalities, from the moment of a gesture or the life of a single organism to the millennia-long presence of a building, a law, a city, or an ecosystem, and the billions of years of our planet. As you'll know, the term overview effect is often used to describe the shift in perception of scale and value that an astronaut experiences when seeing the Earth from orbit. Famously, the first images taken from the moon looking back at the Earth offered a partial access to this shift in our ability to grasp scales. We're adopting this general concept in these lectures, but also insisting that the cognitive shift might be catalyzed by a range of different points of view. Offered positions on the surface of the planet, architectures, ecosystems, or vantage points from inside the code of an artificial or an alien mind. So those are some of the themes that we're trying to take on both across the season and also with the overview effect lectures. Let me introduce Lydia and Fred. Lydia Kallipoliti is an award-winning architect, engineer, scholar, and curator, an assistant professor at the Cooper Union in New York. Prior to Cooper Union, she taught at Rensselaer, where she directed the MS Arch program, at Syracuse, and at Columbia University GSAPP. Her research focuses on the intersections of architecture, technology, and environmental politics, and more particularly on recycling material experiments, theories of waste and reuse, as well as closed and self-reliant systems and urban environments. Her research on the intersection of cybernetic and ecological theories is presented in a variety of media, including online digital platforms, lexicons, databases, and archives, exhibitions, and holographic animations, with the scope of engaging a wide audience in what she calls immersive scholarship. Her work on ecological design is widely recognized. She's been published internationally and has exhibited in a number of venues, including the Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Design Biennale, the Shenzhen Biennale, Oslo Architectural Triennale, London Design Museum, and the Royal Academy of British Architects. She's the author of the online book, History of Ecological Design for Oxford English Encyclopedia, the editor of Eco Redux, a special issue of Architectural Design magazine, that's AD, in 2011, and the author of the book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? And that is Lars Muller Publishers, Storefront for Art and Architecture, 2018. Closed Worlds was also an exhibition originally commissioned by the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, and it traveled to WHO Gallery in Los Angeles and the University of Technology Sydney Art Gallery. So again, it's an incredible pleasure and honor to have Lydia join us as the inaugural speaker for this talk today. Fred Sharman will join us in conversation with Lydia. Fred is one of the exhibitors also in our Venice Biennale Italian Virtual Pavilion group this summer, focusing on space and planetary design. He teaches architecture and urban design at Morgan State University's School of Architecture and Planning. He's the co-founder of the Working Group on Adaptive Systems, an art and design consultancy based in Baltimore, Maryland. Fred's first book, Space Settlements, from Columbia Books on Architecture in the City, was published in 2019, fantastic book. His forthcoming book, Space Forces, and Fred, I don't know, is Space Forces out yet or is it coming out later this year?
Later this year, November 4th.
Fantastic, that will be published by Verso later this year in November. Fred received his master's in architecture from Yale. His writing has appeared in the Journal of Architectural Education, New Geographies, Places Journal, Atlantic City Lab, Slate, Log, Clog, Volume, and Domus. And again, many thanks to Jimmy Hagan for co-hosting today and joining us in the Overview Effect lectures. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Again, a million thanks to Lydia, and I'll let you take it over now, Lydia.
Well, thank you, Ed. I'm so thankful for this invitation and super happy to continue our informal conversations in your living room for years about spaceships, movies that we like about our space. And Fred, as you know, Fred is also a dear friend. I love your book, Space Settlements, and I can't wait to read the next one. So thank you so much for joining the conversation. Thank you also everybody for joining. I'm going to be talking about some itineraries or offsprings from my 2018 book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds. And I will start sharing my screen right now with you. Does it work?
Yes, we can see
okay.
it.
I got a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So this book was a wide research project, and I'm going to talk a little bit about all of its facets later on. But it's interesting that it started from a very proper title, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, which appeals to Reyner Banham's celebrated book, The Architecture of Well-Tempered Environments, and reaches the history of environmental control, the collection of atmospheres, and the whole history of calibrating environments. But I also wanted to use a very ugly subtitle, What is the Power of Shit? ugly because matters of ecology are not just about matters of control and calibration, but also about the visceral experience, the visceral lived experience of being in the world, and the idea that our bodily products, our shit, can come back to bite us in one way or another. So I'm going to start with a very, very basic question. What is a closed world? And what do I mean by that? And I'm definitely not the first person that has used this term. Actually, historian of science Paul Edwards used the term in his own book before me, and he wrote specifically that a closed world is radically divided against itself, turned inexorably inward, without frontiers or escape. A closed world threatens to annihilate itself, to implode from the inside. And while he was writing, Edwards was offering a revisionist history of computing in Cold War America. In the Closed World book that I wrote, I am examining a parallel but a very different kind of history, a genealogy of contained microcosm with a kind of superhuman and hubristic, in many ways, ambition to replicate the Earth in its totality. I was investigating in this book a series of living experiments that forge what I tentatively called a synthetic naturalism, where the laws of nature and metabolism have been displaced from the domain of wilderness to the domain of cities and buildings. Now, the idea of a closed world, of the world in a bottle, is nothing new to architects. Here we see a very iconic example from the famous Viennese radical group Hausrecker Co. This is much lesser known than their balloons that wrap their heads and the balloons that come out of the buildings. It's called A Piece of Nature, and it was exhibited in an art fair in Cologne in 1973, and consequently published as the cover of Casabella magazine in 1976. But it's very interesting because when we see that piece of nature in a jar, it immediately becomes evident that this piece of nature is nothing but a fossil. It marks the demise of nature as an indeterminate field of its own and the beginning of reconstituting or re-engineering nature in pieces. The contained primitive shelter that references in one way or another Marc-Antoine Logier's primitive hut becomes a critique of not only our endangered earth and environment, but also of architecture as an endangered species, as something of the past. Inside the jar, Walter Gropius's phrase, Stunde Null, 0 hour, has finally arrived, and architecture has become altogether a different kind of animal, a collection of atmospheres and controlled calibrations inside a delineated perimeter. The role of closed worlds in the reconstitution of idealized microcosms is tied to the history of utopia. And here we see one of the most famous images that ignite that. Buckminster Fuller and Soji Sadow's Dome over Manhattan in 1960, which is as iconic to architects as is Reyner Banham's sketch with Francois Delegray of the environmental bubble in 1969. But it's very important to see that our canonical understanding of utopia is actually very close to the idealization of a closed system, a self-sustaining physical environment demarcated from its surroundings by a boundary that does not allow for the transfer of matter and or energy. In the post-war period, this kind of very clear encirclement that you see here in Ledoux's second design for the Royal Salt Works reappears this idea through the reenactment of whole earth systems. The recirculation of resources in the global ecosystem was idealized in the idea of circularity of resources and containment in a number of projects that have proliferated post-World War II. In this sense, closed worlds are not only key sites of engineering and environmental production, but also materialize a utopian project to temper and fabricate the environment as a site of architectural production. Nevertheless, closed worlds today are no longer poetic metaphors for lost utopias. they have become profitably real. Our indoor environments are politically charged spaces that reflect social ideas and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Confined within artificial enclosures that we all have lived in during the past almost 2 years of the pandemic, environmental control has enforced biased standards of life, even though in most cases these standards institutionalize absurd criteria that homogenize ideas of comfort and well-being for the entirety of the human race. So in that way, when these ideals are universalized through environmental control, in many ways, closed worlds are also power structures that maintain and manage constancy over bodies and psyches. This is evident through the establishment of thermal equilibriums in interior spaces since the 1950s, sequestered comfort zones that are held within narrow ranges. And you're here seeing a psychrometric chart for Carrier Corporation early on in the 20th century, where comfort is defined between the red and the yellow line. It is a very narrow place that that everybody is allegedly comfortable, and the majority of building production is steered toward maintaining that very small percentage of control of different kind of atmospheric elements. This idea of that chart reflects an understanding of the body as a tool within a constant atmospheric medium in order to control and predict its behavior and growth. It is precisely this mechanical vision of biology that gives life, specifically, as David Gisin has argued in his book on Manhattan spheres, precisely a modern character. If organisms, either people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures that serve a physical equilibrium, one cannot account for the complexity, but neither for the beauty of life. So in many ways, overall in the book, what I have argued for is that the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering has been strongly linked to the conceptualization and production of closed systems. As partial reconstructions of the world in time and in space, closed systems speak of the eerie transference of life using architecture as a mere vessel to secure a compulsive cycling of matter, energy, data, and capital. The projects that are documented in the book don't necessarily represent similar political ideologies. In fact, they represent entirely different political agendas, ranging from military experiments to conquer outer space, to countercultural practices and the nostalgia of the homesteading movement that is supported by left-wing organizations in the 70s, to more recently, the very dubious concept of ecological tourism and environmental capitalism. In every case, these systems are real and they're invested in the strangeness of the real. They've all been implemented and nothing is based upon speculation, but on very real reports. But to witness the journey of the ideas of the complexity of artificial ecosystems and buildings as such, I'm going to go through 3 case studies that have been documented in this book and extract points for a manifesto on the power of shit. And I'm going to start with the most obvious example, which is the most famous closed ecological system ever built, the Biosphere 2 in Arizona. And there has also been a very recent documentary on the Biosphere 2, which is really, really exceptional. And I just want to encourage everybody to visit it. It's really a trip in material and mental dimensions in many ways. The purpose of this facility was to test the viability of a biologically regenerative artificial environment to support human habitation in space and to provide a prototype Earth colony in case the Earth would be destroyed. It was built by a company that was self-proclaimed Space Biospheres Venture, which was a partnership between Ed Bass. He was a businessman and a philanthropist who spent approximately $200 million to build and sustain the facility, and John Allen, who was a systems ecologist and environmentalist. Biosphere 2 supported two missions. The first with a team of researchers that entered the facility in 1991, locked from the exterior world for 2 years and 20 minutes. The team produced their own food and air supply within a heavily sequestered series of ecosystems. During the entire experiment, all of the crew's waste, including waste from their domesticated animals, was recycled through natural low-tech filtration methods. What Biosphere 2 is famous for, it's for its spectacular and public failure. The first mission was notorious for technical and operational failures, especially for not creating enough oxygen. After 6 months, oxygen absorption by raw concrete was still curing, and it depleted levels in the facility by 6%. Along with poor interior air quality, unanticipated species like the one that you see on the screen, cockroaches and crazy ants, thrived without any expectation. And the biospherians suffered from hunger throughout the 2 years of their residency. This is one of the biospherians of the first mission, Roy Lee Wolford, before and after his residency, losing about 13% of his body mass during the experiment. The second mission became infamous for not so much material problems of hunger, unanticipated species, and oxygen, but for mutiny and public feuds among different kinds of stakeholders involved in the facility's management. In time, John Allen, the philosopher scientist, started fighting very badly with Ed Bass, who financed the whole project. The latter camp claimed that Allen and his synergists were destroying the credibility of the project, with Bass taking action in hiring the now controversial white nationalist Stephen Bannon to run Space Biospheres Ventures. This is actually John Allen and the retaliation of Ed Bass, who hired Steve Bannon. The involvement of Bannon, who was at the same time manager of Bannon and co-investment banking in Beverly Hills, was detrimental. With Bass and Bannon's endorsement, the second team of biospherians who entered the facility in 1994 were ambushed by federal marshals. The two men had concluded that the founding management team included Allen and his cult should be evicted. In retaliation, Allen's scientists sabotaged the second experiment by opening the airlocks of Biosphere 2, claiming concern over the health of the inhabitants, and were later arrested. The mission was compromised and it ended soon thereafter. Bannon also had an open quarrel with this biospherian, Abigail Alling, a quarrel which was originally published in the Tucson Citizen in 1996 and resurfaced in the media during the US presidential elections of 2016. It disclosed a series of threats, insults, and accusations of sexual harassment. Arguably, the closed world's material problems that were evident in the first mission were rendered as social and political problems in the second and final human mission. Both events revealed that the idea of dynamic equilibrium of material exchange in an arbitrarily chosen part of the Earth's biosphere cannot set in spontaneously. Redundancy of species and the logic of inclusiveness cannot automatically lead to the very desired idea of cybernetic equilibrium that Allen really wanted to see witnessed in Biosphere 2. But the battle between Allen and Bass exposes a very important dichotomy in environmental politics. That between the idealization of self-organization and the brutality of Darwinian evolution, which was in many ways transposed to social order and policy in the case of Biosphere 2. In many ways, this project exhibits a mythology of consensus based on natural principles and furthers the belief that equilibrium should be translated to social policy and societal values. As a living experiment, the Biosphere 2 demonstrated that the limits of sustainability and the risks associated with closed ecosystems remain largely unknown. After years of research on self-reliance, Stuart Brand, who was the famous editor of the Whole Earth Catalog, confessed that the idea of energy autonomy is a kind of hysteria. Brand's kinship between the closed system and the hysteric body is critical if we reflect on Freud's definition of hysteria as a physiological internal modification of the nervous system. To describe the symptoms of hysteria, Freud spoke of closure as a type of modification that affects an organism alone instead of one that affects an organism and its surroundings. Psychoanalytically, this corresponds to the stage of the protopsyche, at which the organism has control over nothing except for its own self. Ultimately, it functions like an ad hoc sealed structure that regenerates materials out of what is available within the borders of the body. Also, Biosphere 2 has fostered a type of perception of Earth holding. A progeny of Earth photographs that are held gently and affectionately by human hands, as if the Earth is a wounded baby that needs our care. This anthropomorphic perception of the Earth as an endangered living species that is cute and sentient, as a being that needs to be taken care of us humans, its conquerors, is delusional, as it positions our species at the center of all pivotal planetary developments. Our perception of the Earth as one interconnected world, as an image that promotes unity and balance, is no longer the case. Unilateral strategies for divergent problems, in the ideological belief that the metabolism of the planet may become the foundation for technology, culture, and design, is no longer applicable. The Whole Earth Catalog is not so whole anymore, or was never whole to begin with. So from this colossal project of substantial venture capital, which involved vast resources of experimentation, prototyping, construction, communication, I will pass on to a very different kind of precedent and case study, a countercultural urban intervention using minimal resources. And I will focus on the Integral Urban House project, which was completed near 1974 which it was really a domestic organization in an urban setting that was envisioned by its founders as a healthy, natural, cyclical system. And this is their drawing in the kind of homonymous book that they came up with. The project was initiated by Helga and William Olkowski and funded by the nonprofit organization Farallones Institute that was founded by Sim Vanderin, the pioneer of sustainable design and former state architect of California. The actual site of the project was a typical house in Berkeley, California, that was retrofitted by the Farallones Institute to a highly productive test bed for self-reliance, resource renewal, and recycling of waste materials. What was mostly interesting was that the house was tied to its inhabitants almost with an umbilical cord. It needed constant maintenance, and the people who lived in it were linked to it in a very corporeal, material way. The ecosystem of the house was linked to a specific community of stakeholders that each played a specific role in a larger scheme of designed actions. According to its founders, it was significant to repeatedly explain the action plan of life to all members and commit to specific behavioral protocols before coming in to inhabit the house. This format of habitation brings me to an important point, that basically the occupant of a closed world is its own guinea pig. This is what Buckminster Fuller called himself in his essay, Guinea Pig B. He meant B for Bucky. But it's important to see that if the stakeholders are in fact guinea pigs, they do not observe and speculate on possible outcomes. Rather, they're willful part of the experiments in having inserted their bodily parts into the experiment. So the closed world dweller is therefore its feeder and caretaker. They monitor it closely and safeguard its operation. And this was the case with many of the case studies that were analyzed in the book. This is, for example, Auguste Piccard, the French balloonist who reached the stratosphere for the first time in history in a hermetically sealed aluminum gondola that he designed, almost reaching his death with his assistant. He survived by accident landing in the Alps because of promiscuous air currents. This is Russian cosmonaut Evgeny Shepelev, who was the first human to remain in a closed system containing only chlorella as a bioregenerative component. He would eat chlorella and breathe the oxygen that was produced out of chlorella for about 90 days. And this is one of my favorite diagrams of all times. It's the diagram of an anarchist architect called Graham Kane. He studied at the AA and built this house that was called the Ecological House south of London. And in this diagram, he has portrayed himself as a literal biological component of the system. His own shit becomes part of the maintenance of the house. So he never left the premises of the house that he built and occupied. Otherwise, the biotechnical systems would degenerate and die. So while ecological systems of the post-war period portrayed the inhabitant as an indispensable part of a building ecology, currently this image is a disenfranchised narrative. Environmental concerns promote, in many ways, a conservationist ethic and a list of cautionary daily practices of scarcity. And yet there is nothing more visceral as a participatory spatial experience than the scientist's voluntary containment inside the premises of a closed world. To return to the integral urban house, the ambition overall was not to change the system holistically, but to reorient waste as a productive byproduct that fosters different pathways or more possibilities for each cycle of resources. Food production yielded from the management of organic and inorganic waste was key to the integral urban house, as well as to several other domestic experiments at the time that heralded self-reliance from the grid of urban supplies. Making food from shit was the ultimate aspiration that was carried out through many repetitive, dirty routines, such as sorting, composting, mixing mulch for vegetation and animal feed crops. With these aims in mind, the space of the house was not just lived in, but was nurtured and dependent on very subtle fluctuations of material phase changes of the living organic matter that was part of this vessel and the growth of living substances. To achieve all of these challenging conversions, the material conversions, the Institute researched on thermophilic bacteria that had the potential to create protein from the waste of livestock and in forming bacteria soups, which could break down cellulosic waste into protein for animal feed. This type of research was not only conducted by countercultural groups, but also at the same time by major industrial stakeholders like General Electric in their effort to chemically engineer bacteria that perform efficient tasks like eating toxins found in petroleum. Specifically, this guy, Ananda Chakrabarty, who was a microbiologist and genetic engineer at GE, in 1972 developed a man-made living organism, which combined features of several strains of Pseudomonas bacteria that would eat toxins purposely found in petroleum. He attempted to patent the bacteria that he bioengineered, and the patent office rejected his application, leading to a United States Supreme Court case known as the Diamond versus Chakrabarty case, on whether genetically modified organisms could actually be patented. The court in the end ruled in Chakrabarty's favor, stating that the fact that microorganisms are alive is without any legal consequences for the purposes of the patent law. But this is to be debated. And in many ways, the court raised ethical questions as to where life begins and what are the ethics involved in pre-engineering the autonomy of microorganisms. It also silently introduced in the field of designing and building a field of semi-autonomy or disobedience of matter. Now it is a fact that shit may be turned into food, and Graham Kane or the Farallon Institute were not so delusional after all. Nevertheless, with the introduction of these questions into the field of architecture and design, one inevitably accepts that if ecological houses are in fact digestive machines, they need to be disobedient. And this is what autonomy means in many ways. Even if ecosystems are mostly simulated as circular systems that are robust, where waste equals food in a series of cycles and subcycles that promise us life and afterlife of materiality, the idea of self-sufficiency is compulsive and hysteric in many ways, to use Stuart Brand's terms, in the will to endlessly regenerate life or new life from shit. Therefore, to write a counter-history to optimized circular economies in material conversions, one needs to look necessarily at shit. Only through the raw confrontation of this kind may the ecology of life become useful to us. In many ways, shit forces us to look at questions of ecology viscerally via the raw ecology of our bodies and the understanding that recycling is not just a statistical problem that we can relay and distance to data and the management of urban resources, but also a basic bodily reality that affects the water we drink and the air we breathe. Our unwanted odorous and degenerate bodily products have been described as technically powerful and worthy. They can generate methane, meaning power, if treated properly. Then recycling shit to money is as much a subject of theoretical analysis as it is a factual constituent of capitalist production. Waste needs to go away, and the very process of purging, transporting, and carrying shit into oblivion, all that is worthless into something that will become useful, is very profitable for those who manage and transfer the raw materials. In New York City, the beating heart of global finance and culture, there's an enormous amount of poo every day. As reporter Oliver Millman has written for The Guardian, a substantial amount of the city's shit is expelled with this train to Birmingham, Alabama, causing major stink methane clouds 900 miles away. The treated sewage, which is euphemistically known in the industry as biosolids, travels with the poo train to a landfill west of Birmingham, causing what the locals call the death smell. In Alabama, this avalanche of northern poo is part of a wider concern over the environmental risks for residents, particularly the impoverished and people of color. The dismissal of environmental concerns of Alabama residents, mostly residents of overwhelmingly African American communities, has been reported as a case of civil rights and environmental racism. Let us not forget that more than a material, shit also indicates a general state of incoherency, degeneration, and malevolence. You talk shit. This is what we say all the time. It indicates a stage where information is so finely grained and scattered that it cannot form identifiable, repeatable patterns. So from this example, we're going to talk about contamination. Contamination in the case of the Russian experiment of BIOS-3, that was a bioregenerative system at the Institute of Physics of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Siberian branch, a division later renamed the Institute of Biophysics. Construction of BIOS 3 as a closed ecological life support system began in 1965 and ended in 1972, but was taken on for different kinds of missions several times past 1972. And here you see one of the photographs in 1985. In 1972, the experiment ended when a 3-person crew entered the premises and remained enclosed for 80 days. This is a very interesting experiment on many fronts, but there are also incredible photographs of the visualization of containment and the fear of breach that remains unbroken in all photographic representations. Here you see a similar kind of photograph. It's not from BIOS 2, and I'm just pulling out these images for Fred here. It's from the Apollo 12 crew in the US Hornet, which was a facility to quarantine returning astronauts in the US coming from the moon to prevent any possibility of extraterrestrial contamination, forward contamination, bringing deadly viruses from the moon. This is another image of the Hornet with Nixon commending the Apollo 11 astronauts, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin, looking out of the window of the quarantine facility. So looking through circular airlocks renders the perimeter of the facility as a critical barrier not to be penetrated at any cost. But perhaps most importantly, these images render the crew as an object of observation, monitoring, and experimentation. Bodies are no longer outside the biological preserve, but they're inside parts of the experiment. The underground structure, steel structure of BIOS 3 was enclosed 315 cubic meters. Initial prototypes proved that algae could moderate oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in an environment that included human respiration. BIOS 3, which included 2 phytotrons, treated humans and their waste as biological commodities of exchange within an ecological system. The waste of one organism was quite literally food for another. All species were very carefully interlinked in a mathematical model of simulation, especially humans with algae. In BIOS 3, the waste of any system was not contained and extracted as something unwanted and disdained, but processed as input for different uses. The problem of total encirclement, the linkage between species in an idealized cycle of life that BIOS 3 has maintained, shed critical attention to the maintenance of decontamination protocols. Humans and plants were by all means within the premises of a carefully calibrated preserve. The fear of breach was consistent to research that has been conducted for the optimum growth of plants before this experiment, as early as the 1940s by plant physiologist and biologist Fritz Wendt. Wendt specifically invented the notion of the phytotron, which was a fully air-conditioned environment for the growing of commercial crops that maintained constant temperature and humidity levels, and that was developed in response to pollution to the urban environment. The phytotron demonstrated for Wendt that plants that were placed inside its protected and uniform environment grew better than plants placed inside its plants growing in the environmentally variable atmosphere of a city. Eventually, Wendt became quite obsessed with the decontamination of his phytotrons at the Earhart Plant Research Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. His regimes included locked doors, sterilized jumpsuits, and continuous hand washing and hair combing. As he noted, once a person becomes aware of the fact that they may be a vector of insect spreading, it is amazing to observe how many aphids or other plant pests are carried on one's clothing. The very act of entering a controlled sealed space was also the mechanism by which corruption could penetrate the facility. Contamination takes place as soon as humans with microorganisms that inhabit their bodies enter their premises. The laboratory is therefore only a biological preserve until someone enters its premises. The colonization of the laboratory materials, either of biogenic or abiogenic sources. In the case of BIOS-3, the sealed humans were both experimental subjects inside the larger experiments and the monitoring agents of the experiment itself. It was necessary that within the premises of the closed loop experiment, bodies and their byproducts would be reorganized, unpacked, and distributed in space. BIOS-3 was its autonomous governance by those living inside it. There was no interference BIOS-3 was contingent to the actions and decisions of those inside. BIOS-3 not only made it possible to study how humans operated in containment, but also exhibited the problem of the reciprocal influence that microbes and humans have upon one another, a closed ecosystem.
Lydia, sorry, I just want to
For
interrupt.
BIOS-3, autonomous.
1 second. Hi, just want to interrupt you for 1 second. You're cutting in and out just briefly in the last minute or so. Would you mind just backing up just a little bit and then maybe turning your video off?
Yeah,
That might help.
sure. I have to go to Zoom to turn my video off.
Actually, I turned it off for you.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thanks.
So that sounds clear already, Lydia. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. It said something about my connection not being stable, but
It
I
happens.
was hoping that you were listening.
In our world, it happens. All right, thank you.
No problem. I was saying, okay, I don't know what you guys missed. I was talking about BIOS-3 and the experiment, the monitoring agents, the subjects that are enclosed in the experiment being the agents of the experiment itself. And it was necessary that within the premises of this closed loop experiments, bodies and their byproducts would be reorganized, unpacked, and distributed in space to yield other kinds of resources. In addition, one of the unique characteristics of BIOS-3 was its autonomous governance by those living inside it. There was no interference from an external control panel or series of experts monitoring the experiment. BIOS-3 was entirely contingent on the actions and decisions of those living inside. It not only made possible to study how humans operated in containment, but also exhibited that the problem of the reciprocal influence that microbes and humans have upon one another, as well as other problems that arise when more than one person inhabits a closed ecosystem. For BIOS-3, autonomous internal control was vital. In all experimental ecosystems implemented before, human test subjects participated as nothing more than a metabolic link, a part of the material metabolism. Whereas in BIOS-3, it was the first time that in a closed ecosystem, humans were supported as active agents that were taking decisions rather than being passive constituents controlling the evolution of the system inside out. This internalization, both in terms of material and informational resources, is the ultimate example of closure insofar as the concept refers to a system's organic independence and self-governance. The results of these experiments in codependency and cohabitation have demonstrated that while interspecies balance was direly desired, we are far from understanding how to establish it. Intuition seems to tell us that complexity and diversity should lead to stability in a diverse system. And this is the hypothesis of self-regulation, that if one species dies out, another should be available to occupy its niche. Nevertheless, the conclusions of Bio3 was that complexity and diversity increase the chances for some species to act in unforeseen ways. Bio3 presented unexpected findings about the dynamic equilibrium between a human microorganism and its microflora. Closure seemed to entice unpredictable patterns in the constitution of human microbial communities. Human actors demonstrated a shift in their gut microflora under extreme conditions of containment, such as nervousness, physical overwork, and continued feeding on specially developed diets. Particularly in hermetically sealed spaces, significant changes in individual microbiota patterns carry the risk of microbial shock, or the inability of the body to inhibit the growth of potentially pathogenic microorganisms. And humans staying in isolation for a long time usually exchange their microflora with one another, which can often be pathogenic and infectious. In their detailed monitoring of Bio3, plant physiologist Frank Salisbury, along with former director and chief scientist of the Institute of Biophysics in Krasnoyarsk, Joseph Gittleson, and Jemry Lisovsky, concluded that this phenomenon and others demonstrated that enclosing even a relatively large volume with thousands of species is not necessarily sufficient for spontaneous organization of balanced matter turnover. The containment of humans in Bio3, as well as other living simulators, reveals a deeply rooted problem in the idealization of containment as the only measure to obstruct infestation. In closed ecosystem, microbial populations can randomly coagulate in disorderly patterns, producing new bodies, new materials, contaminants that are generated by the system. Leftovers and byproducts of transference processes central to the metabolism of different organisms can sediment and crystallize into new extraneous and material bodies. In other words, the source of infection destabilizing the system can come from the inside. Produced by the interactions of contained subjects and species, rather than an external contaminant penetrating the surface that secures the perimeter of a sealed space. The fear over space within a diseased space, as well as the impossibility of escape, has vividly manifested in visual culture, particularly in films over the past 50 years, but also this has been the reality that we have lived through over the past 1.5 years. And these are some images that are in Brooklyn by photographer Stephen Lovgin through the pandemic. And actually that was in March 2020 at the very beginning of the pandemic, where the idea of containment was the only preventative measure also against disease. And of course, the kind of decontamination protocols that were institutionalized throughout the globe during the novel coronavirus crisis. And all the protocols of entry and re-entry spaces of what are the kind of steps and living patterns one would need to take. And the idea that the interior space based on the different kind of mechanical ventilation systems of aeration and other bodies occupying a space was full of invisible microbial entities that was very hard and difficult to control and visualize. Well, the thin border between the world as we know it and its decayed, invested version was part of a science fiction imagery. Donna Haraway reminds us that the line between social reality and science fiction is an optical illusion. Closed-loop ecosystems are digestive machines, and as such, they're sometimes disobedient. With autonomy comes unpredictability and derailment. Infestation comes from within. In this new world, we're possibly in dire need of a new kind of criticism, of new ways to fathom with the idea of interiorization, and of methods to move past barriers in the way that we narrate stories through the design of our environments, as well as the shaping of our reality. As citizens and creative thinkers, we need to zoom out and effect real change, now that returning to the long normality, as was, is no longer attainable. As a famous movie line suggests, open your eyes to the bubble inside which you're voluntarily contained. Then develop an erotic yet resistant relationship with your containment. In that way, it might be possible to penetrate barriers and imagine other ways of being, even to imagine some real grounds of hope beyond the market commodity of an economic and social euphoria for the few. And a lot of these, I just want to show you some images now because I've gone through the kind of assessment of the idea of 3 case studies of artificial ecosystems that were included in the book, my 2018 book, The Architecture of Closed Roles. And also show you that this was not just a book, it was, I would say, a multivalent effort that was expressed in different mediums. I was very keen to have diverse mediums to explore these ideas, not only in the way that the linearity of a text would require, but also how to inhabit this kind of information in the lived experience of an exhibition, or the kind of the derive experience of traversing through a lot of this material online in a website. The idea of exploring words that are related to some of these concepts in an online lexicon. And of course, a lot of these ideas have also been present in a number of courses that I've taught throughout the years. This is the image of the exhibition, the first iteration of the exhibition, where each case study, I just presented 3 to you today. Each one was one of these tubes that you could occupy personally only. It's interesting when the pandemic has risen, a lot of people were using this image as an example of proxemic theory or social distancing. The circle was exactly 6 feet each. So that was very strange to see it come to real life, that it was almost like a kind of scale to social distance people. So this was the exhibition. You could occupy each one of these pieces of information, these projects, but you could also see them in a line in the way that they have unfolded quite linearly in chronological time. But also you could experience some of these through a kind of virtual reality experiment that was designed by Farzan Loftujaam. He took a lot of these studies and created virtual roles. And this is the second iteration of the exhibition at the Yuho Gallery in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. Again, the kind of makeshift book product that preceded the actual book of the exhibition, the way that it was exhibited in the University of Technology, Sydney, with a different kind of virtual reality experiment. And all of the stories that didn't make it into the kind of archive, which were kind of parallel histories that have yet to be written in one ways or the other. The kind of central core of this poster is the different human subjects that were produced, fabricated by closed roles. And here you have a kind of Neuron Man, which was the test subject of Jacques Cousteau in submarines. excrement man, which is the kind of image that I've shown you of Graham Kane's ecological house, and different ideas of what the subject would be, the one that would inhabit a closed world. Another history running parallel would be these images that were not realized closed worlds experiments, but actually iconic images in the history of architecture, like House Record Coes, the bubble of Rainer Banham, and then in the white boxes you have a very brief and annotated history of social policy, the way that environmental problems were enacted in law and governance, some of them. And this is my last slide. This is the kind of lexicon that is online. If you go to this website, I don't know if you see it, it's www.closed-worlds.com. You can access the lexicon that has all of the words that actually, they're not words that are part of the architect's language in many ways. So the word acclimatization is not a word that architects use, like they use poché, for example, or other terms like figure ground, but they're extremely important in assessing parallel, divergent, but very important history of how we understand spaces through this idea of reproducing natural systems. So thank you very much for listening.
Lydia, thank you so much. That was awesome. That was fantastic. Yeah,
Thanks.
I see some clapping icons floating around there. Thank you. So Jimmy and I were just thinking about whether we should take a break, but I think since we're doing this online, I think folks can always just step away if they need to grab a coffee or take a very short break from the screen. Lydia, let me just ask out of courtesy, are you okay to just forge ahead?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Totally.
Okay.
Totally fine.
So, then Fred, Lydia, why don't we jump into the conversation? I guess the only thing I'll say is I'll ask everybody who's in the audience to keep your microphones muted. And what we'll do is we'll have a conversation between Lydia and Fred and myself for a kind of organically determined period of time. Maybe it'll be 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to everybody who's hanging on here. We're also keeping track of the chat thread. So if you want to float something out to the chat thread, please do so. I see a number of people have been commenting in the chat thread and saying hi and so forth. So please do that. And Jimmy and I will keep track of that, and we'll try to circulate some of those questions in as we transition to the Q&A. Okay. So Fred, can I open it up to you to start?
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, and I'm really grateful to you, Ed, and to Jimmy, and especially to Lydia for inviting me to come and talk with you all, because we could do this again and again and again, and hopefully we will keep having this conversation about all of these issues that are so important to architecture and so important to sort of every scale of spatial practice, which I've been really fascinated by the turn towards these other scales among people who are used to thinking about space. And I was gratified because I pulled out two threads at the very beginning of your talk, Lydia, and then you kind of surfaced both of those themes yourself. But I did want to come back to those, and hopefully we can draw even more. So I'll just sort of throw both of those things on the table, and there are, hopefully there will be like, different places to pick up within what I have here in my notes. And first of all, is this question of like, I say people who think about space, and of course that means so many different things, but we can all sort of talk about those different things, paradoxically in the same kinds of ways. So there's like a kind of ghost haunting these conversations that I think of as isomorphism, where the same kind of structures show up in different scales and in different regimes. we talked in the comments thread about this kind of way in which the material systems break down, or the way in which they catalyze to something, you know, more than the sum of their parts. But also the same thing happens to the social systems and the political systems, the relationships between people, you know, which is very different than the relations between like the fire ants, the CO2, the concrete, and all the things we sort of track within the diagrams. But if you take the labels out of so many of those diagrams, those directed network graph diagrams that show up again and again, we could replace those labels with social factors, economic factors, even cultural factors, and the arrows and boxes, you know, would still sort of seem to make sense. So the one is like, what's up with that? You know, what do you think that means? Is that some kind of pathology that's embedded within, say, people who are practicing design and analysis, so we start to see everything in these same terms, and we start to organize the world into categories and boxes, which may be black boxes, maybe open boxes, maybe closed boxes, but things we can kind of, you know, reduce factors down to, and then carefully, you know, draw those arrows. Is that productive, or is that its own kind of hysteria, you know, in a way? And then, you know, again, as scales shift, I think always of that there's the isomorphism between the mission 1 of Biosphere 2 and mission 2 of Biosphere 2, but also there's, you know, the figure of Steve Bannon who breaks open the seal, like quite literally. But what's happening inside the seal is this production that's going on that's made by this theater company, right? The group has got their start putting on these sort of free association based plays, you know, in the sort of post-60 counterculture hangover. So they're a theater group, and they're put in this box, and they're putting on a different kind of show, you know, in so many ways. And then the figure of Bannon comes in and puts an end to that show. But then, of course, we know he has a second act and a third act and a fourth act as a movie producer in Hollywood, and as the sort of right-hand person to this reality TV star president, and that subsequent ongoing performance. So there's that kind of isomorphism too. And like, what does all that mean as the sort of pathology of the people who make these closed worlds, or who make them into spectacles and stories and plays, you know, for the consumption of those who are outside of them. And then related to that, I think I could bring this to ground, but related to that is the problem of the outside of the closed world. You know, we have the Reyner Banham environment bubble, which shows up again and again, which is, you know, designed to present, you know, the body of Delagray with Banham's head photoshopped onto it. You know, there's a presentation of an inside to an outside, which, you know, is of course, you know, harkening back to Le Corbusier's soap bubble and the idea that an outside should just be the simple result of what's going on the inside. You know, Banham and Delagray are playing with that, but designers have sort of lost a lot of those lessons. You know, that the presentation of the inside to an outside is really important as well. You know, I think of the International Space Station as something that it's almost completely visually incoherent. It's like noise. You can't sort of grok it. You can't draw a clear outline around it like you can a bubble. It's hard to remember what it looks like. Whereas the overview effect, you know, when we're talking about the overview effect, it's about that perception of the world and its presentation to an audience outside of it, that's now newly outside of it. And then, of course, you showed these great stuffed animal Earths and the kids sort of cherishing them as a sort of coda, or again, second act maybe to the why haven't we seen a photo of the whole Earth yet question from Stuart Brand. Is like, now we have it, you can buy it as a stuffed animal. So a couple of threads there. Isomorphism, like what's up with that, and why does that show up again and again? And the question of representation and the role of design to sort of mediate or translate between an inside and an outside for good or for evil.
That's a lot of questions, my
That's
dear.
a lot of questions.
No, they're all really, really good questions. Let me see how I can start to tackle it. I'll start with, I'll use a different word, not isomorphism, because it might mean, isomorphism means a lot of different things to me, but I'll start with an engineering term, the flow chart. And I'll use this term because one of the intentions when I was trying to document in drawing, right, the idea of the closed world was to reinvent the flowchart, because in many ways the flowchart is a kind of idealization of the way that a system should work mathematically, but in many respects that becomes not synchronic to the material reality of that system. And it's a very big problem because almost all of these systems and all of the kind of space shuttles and they're first becoming conceptualized in a flowchart, which is made out of boxes where you don't really know what happens in each box, and there's this kind of circulation from box to box. Mm-hmm. But as an architect, what I was struck with is how problematic it becomes for us to literally relay environmental representation to arrows and boxes, because that's the only way that we can somehow use a visual language. And I think the visual language of environmental representation is a really widely disseminated problem. There's no accepted visual language. I think T.J. Demis wrote a book. I was just reading it actually yesterday. It's this one. Well, you can't say it, but he's just making that argument that what is the visual language of the Anthropocene, and there's no unilateral. So it becomes an issue when and how a system can be represented when, is a box and a kind of, let's say, different shaped vessel behaving the same within a system? No, they don't. And the engineering approach doesn't really reveal or speak to that in one way or another. So I think that it becomes a very important aspect to look at these systems as lived experiences, not in the way that they become simulations or models or equations of ideas in the way that they're working, but in the way that they're actually that systems are actually connected to each other. But more so, I think the problem of maybe isomorphism and the idea of the flowchart is the idealization of the circle, the idea that almost ecology is a circular form of reasoning that demands circularity or the regeneration of resources. And there's no other way that we can legitimize or conceive the notion of ecological systems without idealizing the problem of encirclement. And I think this becomes very evident in a lot of these projects, in the way that there is no other way than understanding metabolism, the act of life, as coming to full circle. And I think that this is a kind of pathology. Yes, it is. It's a kind of simple model that becomes digested, but life is much more complex, and these systems are behaving in very, very different ways. And I think it's really important to see that and document that. Now, about scales, because you did mention scales. Scale is a huge problem in environmental representation. And I think that in the Biosphere 2, when I went, I'll start with an anecdote. I visited, and there was this biologist that was giving a tour of the facility. And she was showing us these tiny little bottles of a microbiologist in the 1950s called Claire Odom. Not Odom, the kind of Eugene Odom, and Claire Odom. And the Biosphere 2 was based on his experiments with these bottles. But it was a massive jump in scale. And I think that's a hugely problematic. The idea, I don't know if it's isomorphism. Michelle Addington, when we were discussing it, Fred, she referenced to this problem of geometric similitude of geometry becoming a kind of tool for architects that expresses certain concepts in different scales in a kind of seamless or smooth way, that jumping from one scale to the other doesn't really fracture the system. But when you have material life and biology, it completely fractures the system. It doesn't work in any way in the same way. So I think that this is a very important problem that occurred in many of these. There was a lab test of an idea working on a certain scale, and when it was transposed to a different kind of scale, it was a completely different reality. And this is something very fundamental to understanding architecture, not just as a kind of formal outcome of an envisioned geometry, of an envisioned idealized geometry, but as a kind of lived experience, which contains living matter and life. Then it becomes so much more of a complicated action. So for the third part of the outside, the inside and outside, I don't know if I can answer it directly, or I think it's a really interesting question to think of why. And I've been thinking through this during the pandemic as well. Why are we so persistent on reconstructing worlds, on architecture not just becoming, fostering needs and care to whatever is needed, but reconstructed a kind of world anew? And this hubris is something that you're referencing in your book as well, with Space Settlements, for example. You did when you critiqued the Google headquarters and Apple headquarters and all of these corporate worlds. The intent was not just to provide a space for people to work, but also to reconstruct entire world sections and biomes and regions. And the most striking example is Amazon's new headquarters, the biospheres, the jungle biospheres, whatever they're called, in Seattle, that literally recreate another section of the world, like another natural section of the world, a biome, to come and inhabit downtown Seattle. So it's a very interesting question. Why is that something that becomes a kind of cultural desire, and we persist on pursuing this modality of development, whereas there's so many kind of not only technical problems but also social problems of creating privileged groups that inhabit one of these bubbles and others that don't. So it's a very big question, and I wish I could have others chime in on this too. But it's one main question that I'm left with after having written this book.
Two things that struck me with regard to the question of representation from your talk just now in a new way is the integral urban house and the way it looks so normal from the outside. It looks like a normal Berkeley house. You'd have to expect from the diagrams that it's have all these tubes, running from room to room, carrying all these substances in the closed loop and figuring, the system. But it doesn't look like something out of Blade Runner. It looks like something out of, Leave It to Beaver. And then the juxtaposition of the Airstream trailer, what was the name of it?
The US Hornet?
Yeah, the Hornet.
Hornet.
The Hornet looks more like a spaceship than the Apollo command module, because it is, it has that sort of connection to design thinking that's explicitly aesthetic that I think is not brought to the space program when those concerns are seen as exterior to engineering concerns. I'm always fascinated by the different design cultures and the way they deal with these questions too, because of course then the aesthetic of the Apollo command modules returns to the design world through so many other different channels, not the least, Rayner Banham is one, but that kind of NASA aesthetic that he talks about directly is something that he now uses to figure, technology and its relationship to culture. So, there are no easy answers, of course, but the Airstream and the Apollo command module as two different ways of thinking about how to figure technology and futures were really, really striking in this presentation of the work.
Yeah, no, I think that's again, then that's an open question, right? I don't have like an answer as to why this is happening, but what it makes evident is that there's no, this idea of understanding the world as through the problem of encirclement of resources of matter, energy, data, and capital is not contingent to a certain formal aspect of building it as such, that it is a choice. And I've seen a lot of different projects that are of entirely different kind of formal aesthetics and also political ideologies that are expressing the same kind of desire of rebuilding the world anew, of rebuilding, of understanding architecture not just as a vessel that houses certain kinds of activities, but it's a different way of understanding the world. It is like reproducing a kind of a piece of nature, like it's producing nature. It becomes a product. It produces nature on its own right, and that can happen with aesthetic is a choice in many ways for leftist architectural groups. It was a deliberate anesthetic in a way of leaving the aesthetics to become what Graham Kane used to call an eyesore, which was a kind of deliberate choice of not dealing with it, of not having a kind of polished version of what this world would look like, versus other projects that were of the techno utopian tradition, let's say, that would appeal to Space Odyssey and Rayner Banham.
Lydia, I would want to pick up on the representation question that Fred brought up. Just as a side note, I'm reminded sometimes of this line from Milan Kundera, where I think not in one of his novels, but one of his essay books, he says that kitsch is life without shit. And it's a kind of a one-liner, but it's also a very interesting one-liner in the sense that one could simply define kitsch as a kind of culture and a worldview which denies the existence of waste or of shit. And one of the lines that you used in your talk that caught my attention in relationship to that was this idea where you said that it could also be understood as a state of general incoherence or even malevolence. You said a stage where information is so finely grained and scattered that it cannot form identifiable and repeatable patterns. And, Fred, it seems to me that this is an interesting place to kind of like connect to the problem of representation, because no matter what discipline we're in, architects, systems designers, engineers, we tend to use models to reduce the behavior of complex systems to what we hope are the relevant variables that if we work with them, will actually either control the system or at least have partial engagement, interface, and control with the system, and so the way that Kundera is provocatively saying, like kitsch as a kind of a cultural state of mind or point of view would be a denial, actually, of all of those finely grained aspects of the behavior of quote, real systems, seems to me to be exactly what's at stake there in terms of representation. And so I tend to think that there have been projects, as you all know, over the many decades in architecture to imagine systems behavior. And I guess for me, I would go back through Fuller, but also look at Donella Meadows and the the Limits to Growth Project and Doxiadis and Delos conferences, all of those examples, the Macy's, interdisciplinary attempts to find the places where, as Lydia, you were saying, like the Freudian model of hysteria actually can leap the boundary from being a model only of an interior psychological subjective state to actually not just being a shared psychological subjective state, but being an operative system that then does interact with the way that energy is managed or the way that bacteria behave. And this for me connects also, Lydia, to the question of what it means to either make a world or to be trapped in a kind of disciplinary practice where we're always trying to make a world or trying to make a system that contains a microcosm of the world. For me, Kim Stanley Robinson's work has been pretty important in the way that some of his characters in 2312 Swan, they're all multiply gendered, but I guess loosely we could say Swan could be referred to as a she. Swan, what she does is she's a terrarium engineer for a part of her life. And there are these very beautiful passages in 2312, which are written from the point of view of an engineer designer who's giving you instructions on how to design a terrarium. Well, you hollow out an asteroid and you get these kinds of metals and these kinds of chemical systems and this kind of base muck of bacteria and viruses, and you seed the asteroid and then you wait a certain period of time. But then it's very beautiful because Swan and Kim Stanley Robinson at a certain point says, but be very careful, because if you have something like a marshland, I think he's saying, like that kind of fundamental biome, you can fall in love with it. And so got to be careful, because if you want to grow an asteroid that actually has pampas, or a jungle or a kind of a high desert biome, like if you start with a marshland, watch out. I hope I'm remembering correctly that it's marshland. Somebody jump in and correct me, but you got to watch out, because you might really want to keep it there, even though you initially intended it to be some other kind of biome. And so I feel like there's a really, really interesting example there that it seems to me, Lydia, in all of the work that you've done with this book and the other work, it's just always trying to think those connections between the individual and the kind of interiority of the individual, which is actually already connected out to the world and sociality, Fred, and as you were pointing out, and to the material systems, that it's actually hooked up to those material systems. It's funny because I saw Mark Nelson do a talk at a conference a few years ago about the theory of all possibilities and some of the biosphere work. And I hadn't known that much about their work until I was at that conference with him and some of the other people there. And I was super impressed with and on the one hand, you'd say, oh, it's very much of the 60s. It's very much a countercultural movement which would resist modes of representation to achieve some other collective modality of representation. But they were thinking very lucidly about material practices, about the way that a theatrical gesture could be linked to an ecosystemic gesture, could be linked to an infrastructural gesture. And so I was actually blown away by the level of thinking that they had. And it seems to me that, Fred, Lydia, that what you're talking about is very much connected with that endeavor to keep in mind all of the kind of microcapillary actions and macroscopic actions of a system, and then like trace the thread from one scale up through another scale, back down, and then, zooming way up to the largest scale and say, well, maybe this is actually where the system is most operative. And so, representationally, it's difficult because, as you were saying, in terms of the flow chart, Lydia, the black box is just a black box in a network system. I remember looking at the Donella Meadows and Limits to Growth arguments, and with the technology they had at the time, they tried to come up with what they thought were effective black boxes that they could run in a simulation, basically saying, like, we know we're reducing an extremely complex system to an extremely small set of parts, but we think these are the kind of hinge points or the catalyst points. And so we can run a simulation and we can draw some hopefully useful knowledge from running the simulation with such a reduced kit of parts. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that's at stake in the representation question. So that was a really long way of building up to a question for you, Lydia and Fred, which would be, how can we reimagine the representation problem, right? Like you, Lydia, and also you, Fred, you have compiled taxonomies and studied all of these different modes of representation. So is there, Lydia, in your book, you talk about points of failure in each of the case studies. Is there a place where you would start pointing us towards points of success, critical points where we can intervene in systems?
I thank you, Ed. That was amazing. Your reading. I don't know if that's an answer, but I want to refer to. I loved your citation. Kitsch is life without shit. This is amazing, and I just want to point you toward, everybody toward a text that was very, very influential for me in thinking about shit in quotes. And it was by a Hungarian psychoanalyst that was very close to Fred. His name was Sandor Ferenczi. And he wrote a text called The Ontogenesis of the Interest in Money. And all of the text was really about the problem of representation because he was making a very unconventional argument, basically arguing that shit and money derive from the same primordial matter, but they're just expressed in different material stages. It was a whole kind of psychoanalytic theory, but in many ways he was saying that shit can become mud, and mud can become sand, sand can become, which is dehydrated mud, then mud can become pebbles, which are unearthed sand, and pebbles become coins, which become money. And he had this whole kind of serial process of transformation from I mean he basically, of course it's idealized and it's in the realm of fantastical realm, but I think the way that he was analyzing this was literally a problem of representation, right? What are the qualities in each one of these material stages that make something what it is, and what are the thresholds to which we can assign a property and say this is sand because it is not wet and it is not mushy and it is so forth and so forth. And I think another argument that he was making is that pebbles are digested by the psyche because we know what they are. Like it's very easy to grasp what they are. They're like little objects that are shiny, and they're introjected by the body, whereas shit is rejected by the psyche and the body, and they're much harder to grasp. I don't know if that sheds any light at all. Maybe it obfuscates the question even further as to how we can imagine the representation. But I think that right now in terms of how as architects we imagine an environmental system, there is still a problem of deduction, not a problem of complexity. We're still, we're very reductive in the way that we are representing environmental systems, and mostly using a very specific way to do it, which is through the use of arrows and feedback cycles of what goes where. But the kind of, let's say if we think of water, we don't think of like the weight of water or the volume of water. We think of where it goes and where it comes from. And that becomes a teleological process, right? A linear way of cycling. And I think, if we think of it in different terms, we become more precise, but we lose the capacity to have control of all or oversight of all of these systems. So I don't know what the silver lining is. Like, this is an open question for me, and one that I don't think that I will answer today. I think in many years I will still be thinking about it. But I think the failure is, it's the idea, the pathology of encirclement, but also the problem of deduction, that as architects, we tend to think excluding organic matter from these kinds of conversations, and understanding it as excluded from the interior, as Fred would say. I don't know if Fred wants to reflect on this too.
No, the description of the salient aspects of shit that you gave in your talk and that Ed quoted at the beginning of our conversation, it makes me think now, again, bringing in the question of the pebbles and the coins, like of course, there's the alchemical aspect to all that, of finding in the base matter value. But there's also the kind of the attention paid to to the process and the way that can expand bases of knowledge in a non-reductive way. I'm also thinking of like Rachel Carson's description of what's at the bottom of the pond. Where do things fall ultimately out of sight before they come back in new and unexpected, sometimes destructive ways. And that sort of tracing, or that sort of bringing back of our attention towards the things that we don't see or don't think about, and their capacity to provide too much, right? The stuff at the bottom of the pond for Rachel Carson was providing too much of these, at first trace amounts of pesticides that were relatively harmless, on their own, but then too much gets concentrated and it does things that we hadn't anticipated or intended. And then the shit does too much, more than we can anticipate or intend to use. Almost like the ultimate object of object-oriented ontology, right? It is not exhausted. The object of shit is not exhausted by our analysis. But that analysis is, in the way you're talking about it, the analysis is also productive on its own, in spite of, or maybe because of, the attention that we pay to the abundance that it offers, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it's important, since you mentioned OOO, that at one of the conferences that was held in New York, I think it was 2013, Mackenzie Wark was speaking, and she framed her talk entirely around a re-acronymizing of OOO into POO. And of course, it was a tongue-in-cheek vis-a-vis praxis-oriented ontology as opposed to object-oriented ontology. But it dovetails beautifully, Lydia, with what you and Fred are talking about. Because again, it would be this kind of base material. If Earth is the base material, but then what's the next base material up? Maybe waste or shit is the next level up in that system. Maybe we could open it up to a few of the questions in the chat, and also if people who are in the audience could do the Zoom thing of raising your hand. I think you can do that underneath the reaction button in your Zoom interface. But I could get it started by reading one of the questions. Thank you, Weston. Thanks a lot. Weston just posted the link to Mackenzie Wark's essay on the OOO to POO in the chat. Artemis had dropped something into the chat a few minutes ago. Artemis said, "Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. My question is there any part in your book or in general in your research where you compare the utopia of closed worlds to the utopia of the infinite, open, no border kind of condition that many radical architects such as Superstudio or Archigram have fantasized?" So that was from Artemis Papachristou.
A fellow Greek. That's a very good question. I think I haven't really thought about it. Like when I was thinking of what would constitute material for this kind of project, right? It was very important. I set up a bunch of criteria, right? So one was that it had to be not a fantasy of an architect, but actually a lived experiment. So that was very important. But if we compare it to the visions, I think it would be much more pertinent to compare the idea of the closed world of Bucky, let's say, of the dome over Manhattan to Superstudio. And I think that even if one Bucky sets up a very precise, let's say, perimeter in understanding and calibrating all of the interior capital of people, energy, matter inside that perimeter. And Superstudio circle the Earth with their Infinite City and Archizoom. They're still, in many ways, understanding the planet as something that is to be designed. And both projects are kind of concluding that the planet could or should be geoengineered or designed and calibrated. So I think that even if there are, let's say, different tectonic suppositions or propositions as to how this utopia would emerge, I still conceptualize the infinite city as something that doesn't reach outside, but it kind of marks the planet in a certain way, just like Ledoux marked territory in the 19th century, even though it was in a circle. So this is not, maybe this response right now, Artemis, is not exactly well thought of because it's the first time that I'm thinking through it. But I'm not tending to think that the idea of a closed world is something that is only delineated within the perimeter of a circle, but it's within the idea of how you mark territory and how you reconstruct a model of a world. So I don't know if you want to, if that answers your question, or you want to ask another one. Is she here?
Yes, Artemis is here. You want to jump in, Artemis?
She does not. It's okay.
No, she's here, but I think we're trying to unmute. Let me see. You should. We can't hear you, Artemis. Shucks.
Maybe in the chat.
Yeah, Artemis, if you can drop something in the chat, that would be great. Fred, do you want to follow up on that? Artemis says we can continue. Okay.
Well, it makes me think of that the kind of inversion or back and forth between closed worlds into open space, and the one of the methodologies behind making a closed world in order to reproduce a small Earth or a pocket world is to go elsewhere into what people see as more open-ended systems and expand outward. So it's this like back and forth between. I took my hand off the. It's this back and forth between going in order to go outward, in order to go inward again, in order to go outward. Again, a kind of strange shape there, a strange diagram there. But those, I think, I agree with what Artemis identifies. The two ways of being are intertwined in an interesting way.
Yeah, I guess I find the ways that SuperStudio and ArchiZoom thought through some of these problems to be really crucial. And Lydia, you might remember this, Fred, you also. There was a moment, and I can't recall if it was at a conference or in a text that he wrote, where Txumi said that basically SuperStudio, ArchiZoom, they were verifying the present. They weren't predicting the future, and that's stuck with me forever. Because in that sense, I would strongly agree with what Txumi was saying, that essentially they had recognized certain kind of planetary scale operations that were well underway. They just might not be entirely visible at that time in the 60s and the 70s, but they were well underway. And they were being driven sometimes by industrialists, culture, politicians, designers who had some degree of awareness of the interrelations of the systems and where one system might be closed and one might be partly open, one might be open. But in many cases, they were simply being driven by people who are participating in the system and were the general world system, and were being moved by that system as cogs in that larger system. It seems to me that asking that question about the utopia of the infinite, Artemis, it ties back, Lydia, for me to what I think is a really, really important part, or a really important dialogue to link to your work. For a number of years, I was interested in Geoffrey West's notion of superlinear scaling, and how in some of the arguments that West makes, cities are these kind of superlinear, superorganismic systems where they don't behave like the transition you get from a hummingbird to an elephant to a dinosaur. You slow down. The system reaches a certain kind of critical mass and it can't really grow much more. And West's argument is essentially that cities can keep growing and they keep getting faster and more dense and more intense as they grow. And Freeman Dyson, the renowned physicist, visionary mathematician, Freeman Dyson wrote a review of one of Geoffrey West's books about, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. And in it, he was gently critical, saying that basically what West did is missed one of the most important points, which is when you evaluate any system, whether it's a hummingbird or an elephant or a city, you can't evaluate it based on its independence from gravity and literally a cosmologically scaled gradient. And, Lydia, in your book, you talked about Cousteau, and you talked in the Conshelf project about John McHale's vertical mobility diagram. And I was looking at that last night and I was thinking, wow, this is all totally connected, because if McHale's vertical mobility diagram goes from like the Marianas Trench all the way up to satellites in orbit and presumably farther up the gravity well, then what Freeman Dyson is talking about basically is he's saying, anytime you have a complex system that is at some place, at some depth, or height in the gravity well, you'll get a certain kind of binding of energy and material. And that will lead to complex self-sustaining, if you want to call it in Schrodinger's sense, negative entropic systems, life, hurricanes, dissipative structures. And so what you have to do is you always have to evaluate the system where it sits in a gravity well. And basically, Dyson was saying in a gently critical way of West, you forgot to evaluate all of this in the sense of all of these thermodynamic systems are at 1G, and they could be deeper in or they could be higher up. But don't forget about gravity, because all thermodynamics gets completely rejiggered when you drop it into the universal gravity system. And it struck me that that's also a really cool place to connect to the waste problem, because waste does different things at different gravity gradients. And maybe I'm being loose with gravity, because obviously the poop train to Alabama is on the surface of the Earth, and it's basically at 1G from New York to Alabama, but the concentration within the train is very different at 1G. When it starts its journey, during its journey, when it arrives, when it's being processed. And so all of these concentrations and gradients are things that both get left out of the general model, get left out of the representations. Like Fred, you were talking about isomorphisms, and I kept thinking, of course, it would make sense that there would be an isomorphism between the behavior of one system and another. It's similar to what Manuel de Landa said when he compared lasers to tsunamis, because they both are governed by similar principles of soliton waves in material systems.
Same diagram, yeah.
And so it seems that that's a place where, Fred, maybe you can dive back in here, where it is appropriate to find the isomorphisms, because then you can learn from a laser to understand how a soliton wave might form in an economy or in a metabolism.
Couldn't say it better than DeLanda.
Ed, do you know that Freeman Dyson wrote a proposal? He's one of my favorite characters, actually, because he was one of the people that would, he's a reactionary figure, right? Like he goes against a lot of the known notions of what causes climate change and self-regulation. So but I just wanted to tell you one thing, not necessarily to solve the global waste problem. He actually did a proposal in, I think, late 1970s with NASA to shoot garbage to outer space and solve like the...
I didn't know that.
You should look that up. It was amazing. Like he devised, and it was in the New Scientist, and I remember reading about it at some point in life when I was doing my PhD. He made like one of these vertical pipes that resemble McHale's vertical mobility, but in materialized form. And he had a plan to shoot garbage into outer space and float it in orbit. And I just wanted to tell you that I don't know how that would do different things in different gravity problems, or how to address that. But yes, it's an interesting coincidence, I think.
Do we have any folks who are in the audience who want to jump in, ask a question using your voice? Please do. Please wave your hand or just jump in and join the conversation.
I see Will has raised his hand.
Awesome. Hi, Will.
Hey, hey Ed. So I'm just getting my cameras linked. Oh shoot. Well, I'll figure this out, but I'll start talking. Thank you so much, Lydia. I didn't know about your work, and it's sort of like incredibly mind blowing. And there's also so much being talked about here at super speeds that it's hard to keep up with the material scales of Delanda's photon transportation cameras. But I have well, Lily, I'll ask you a question actually, because I'm just wondering if you, well, a really quick question and then hopefully a longer question. One is if you are sort of plugged into the conversations around the etymology of the word hysteria.
If I'm, is that the question? What is the etymology?
Yeah, do you know?
Of the word? On the top of my head, and this is not something that I can kind of like, vouch my soul to, but I think it comes from hystera, which is like a uterus, like ancient Greek hysteria. It's related to the womb and the kind of feminine body, and the materiality of the womb as a kind of volatile organ that generates its own world in a way. So it's been hystera. If you think of it that way, it's also been linked to philosophical debates about ways of eminence and discourses of emergence. So, but the way that Freud and psychoanalytically it has been used, it's not directly linked to the womb, like he didn't explicitly, well, he was sexist, but he wasn't that much sexist, I guess, in the way that he was analyzing hysteria. He did declare it as a kind of feminine problem, but it was understood as a kind of physiological modification of the internal nervous system, anatomically and materially. So in a way, hysteria means that the body is stuffed or filled with kind of nerves that generate new kind of unforeseen conditions, and the whole kind of nervous system acts in different ways. But it's not directly genitalized to the womb, because other psychoanalysts at that time thought that it also means that in different parts of the body that are not genitalized, that are not kind of like traditional genitals, are also behaving like genitals during conditions of hysteria. I don't know if that answers your question, or it's too much psychoanalytic theory.
No,
but,
so short answer is yes. You know the etymology. I asked because that question, and I'm wondering, like, to what extent you work or sort of the discussions of but like Kristeva and Irigaray, as well as Braha Ettinger, who's my only interlocutor on the subject, but this sort of critique of classical psychoanalysis of the uterus in the pre-birth phase being a hysteric space, and the sort of womb, it is only this is my understanding, there's only hysteria or insanity, psychosis even more particularly, prior to actually birth.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in all of these questions, but are you an architect, Will, or no? You're not.
I guess transdisciplinary.
Transdisciplinary.
Yeah.
I come from the discipline of architecture, and I think metaphors are useful, but they're useful up to a point, you know. If because if we take all of the, let's say, the theory of psychoanalysis and transpose all of these notions to the way that we, let's say, construct the built environment, not everything will be useful. But I think that the metaphor of hysteria is incredibly useful to analyzing systems in general and the way that closure impacts different kinds of systems, whether these systems are lived systems, inhabited, or they're not inhabited by humans, or they're just cybernetic or computational systems. So I'm very interested in all of these psychoanalytic terms, but I'm also cautious at the same time of one-to-one, let's say, matchmaking of these terms to build metaphors. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, I think hysteria is incredibly useful in the study of closed systems because of the unpredictability and the kind of unexpected generation of matter, protocols, contracts within kind of different systems that are closed. At the same time, I feel that there's a limit to how useful psychoanalytic models become as, let's say, design mechanisms. I don't know if Fred and Ed feel the same way, but I'm trying to be cautious of that.
No, I think so. I do. Fred, you should jump in, because I think we were commenting in the chat about the limits of representational systems, and Fred, I think you said like diagrams in that same vein. I mean, I find, for example, Virginia Woolf's writing to be incredibly powerful, in part because of the writing itself, and in part because of the way that Auerbach unpacks the incredible cross-linkages of systems in his analysis of her writing in his book Mimesis. You know, and so that for me was very revelatory, because it actually became useful as a way of thinking across different disciplines and domains, above and beyond the fact that her writing is just transcendently beautiful and incredible. And so, you know, in that sense, for me, I guess I always am looking for ways to transport, and I know Carla thinks about this too, like interloped disciplinary activities or smugglings from one disciplinary domain to another, but not willfully, you know, not without some kind of pretty critical, either pre-advanced thinking about how it might be useful, or at least critical intuition about how it might be useful to then test it out. But definitely, like it only goes so far, and yeah. In
some sense, you know, I was just trying to connect it back to what we were talking about with regard to isomorphisms and diagrams before. You know, metaphors are fascinating on a meta level for this discussion, because they are what transfers between closed worlds, right? Between disciplines and regimes. They can open up these boxes and allow their contents, or the arrangement of their contents, to be useful. I won't ask, but do moving vans really say metaphor in Greece? If you go to Athens, do the moving vans really say metaphor on them?
Metaphora.
Metaphora, yeah. So there's a moving from box to box, right, of contents. Then of course, when we're talking about diagrams, you know, the question is, and I think it's an open question, is does a diagram have some sort of independent existence on its own? You know, the diagram, again, back to DeLanda, Reese, is the same diagram that describes or motivates an internal combustion engine, is the same diagram that describes or motivates a hurricane. So storm is an engine. But is there, you know, is the diagram a third thing, or is the metaphor a third thing that exists independently of both of these material systems that it can manifest or drive? You know, is an interesting open question too. But at the end, you know, and again, at the end of, well, not the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, hopefully, I find philosophy, diagrams, metaphors, literature, useful insofar as like, does it make you want to sit down and draw as an artist and designer, as a practitioner? Like, what does it motivate you, to produce more? That's the kind of utility of both diagrams and philosophy, and thinking about the philosophy of diagrams maybe that I found.
Maybe we should move on. We have 20 minutes or so left, so perhaps we should move on to the next person who had wanted to jump in. I think it's Lou.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. I'm Lou. I'm mathematician and complex system scientist. My training, and Lydia, we wrote to you because we are working with Strelka Institute now. And we wanted to actually, I personally really wanted to ask you your take on actually those closed cities constructed in the USSR times. I'm not talking about the biosphere, but more those atomic cities. If you know any good hints on that, and if they were considered from not just complex systems perspective of Jeffrey West or any of the Santa Fe crowd, but more from maybe sociological, economic, geographical. Thank you.
Hi,
And
did you email me? Are you the one that you emailed me? You did,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yes, hi.
Thank you for the
Nice to
invitation.
see. Nice to see your face. So, no, I have to say, like, your topic is very interesting, and I've worked with Strelka before, and the work is amazing. So I'd really like to contribute to your thought. Let me understand the question a little bit better. Is the question if there are you found certain examples of cities in the Soviet Union that are that were post-nuclear disaster sites, right?
Not only sites, right, but those cities which you cannot access, even being Russian, right? Even having a Russian passport, you can't access because they have some certain secret, like plutonium production sites, or like Arzamas 16, those cities where scientists were working on this, Los Alamos, basically, of the USSR, kind of, right? So they are not really closed worlds in a sense, but they are for some in some certain sense, right? They are, because you cannot really access any sites, and people, they have kind of infrastructure built for them. So I don't know if maybe USA, right, researchers have been working on considering them. Yeah, exactly, Frederick. There are 44 of them now in Russia, and they have different statuses. I was living in one of them, but yeah, now not anymore. And we, with a group of researchers from Strelka, we all were interested because of their different sides of them, not just because they're closed, but also to understand better how actually they integrated and how actually they worked in the past and the future.
That's super, super fascinating. And I'd love to know more and continue the conversation. I think there's I'll give you an actual reference, and then I'll tell you what I think about it. I think in the 2012 Venice Biennale Russian Pavilion, there was some research on some of these sites. So you can look into that. I don't remember exactly what the title was. I think at that point the pavilion was, the Russian pavilion had a kind of dome with QR codes, and all the dome was QR codes. And on the bottom level, there was a research with tiny little images of cities that you could, just Google it and you'll find it. And some of them were these sites that you're referencing. But so that's just a technical citation where to find some information. But the way I see it is it's super interesting because I don't know exactly the logistics of access, but I would think that access is key to investigating that project, because unlike, let's say, a nuclear test facility that's covered in concrete, right? These islands that, they have to shield nuclear material, and then they cover
all of the island with 2 meters thick concrete, and it's materially dangerous, and it's very much the idea of closure or entrapment is manifest materially. I think in these sites is very interesting because the question of borders and access becomes sketchy. Like, we don't really know what the access is and how you can access it, and maybe something is hidden inside a kind of mountain, a fake mountain underground, and the world seems normal from above. It reminds me from like, do you know the CERN in Geneva?
Yeah, sure.
So like in the CERN, it's very interesting because everything is just like so low underground, and they do these kind of cosmic experiments for the Milky Way, and then above that, cows are grazing the meadow, and you have no idea if you're a passenger. It depends on what is the subject that looks at this landscape on what kind of a closed world it is. If you're a passenger in a vehicle, you have no idea of the existence of this facility. If you're a scientist going down there, you have a very, very different worldview. And I think it has to do very much with, this project is very interesting if you think of who is the viewer, who is the one, what is the subject that accesses these facilities, and what is the worldview of that subject? Very much like Jacob von Uxel, for example, who was an early famous, one of the fathers of modern ecology, early biologist of the 20th century, would talk about Umwelt and argue famously, okay, that each organism has its own worldview. I think it's very similar, like, because we're so different as as a human species, we also construct worldviews. Even if we're all human, we don't have different eye bandwidth necessarily. We're not aliens and humans, but because of the way that we traverse landscapes and the way that we experience the world, there's a very, very different worldview. So I think that is a super fascinating subject as to for whom it is a closed world. And and I think that that's where I would start looking into, right, about borders and understanding how is closure manifest, materialized, and enabled. Because in many ways, when Bucky drew a dome over Manhattan, it was very literal. It was just like, okay, here's a circle, boom, that's it. But what you're saying is not so self-evident. It's almost like a latent condition of these environments. So I would think of this of this kind of research in this way, I guess.
Thanks, Lou. Maybe we could move on to Dana. I think Dana was queued up.
Hi, Lydia. Thank you for your wonderful talk and the discussion with Ed and West. Yes, Friedrich. Sorry, it was wonderful. Yeah, I'm actually working with you, so I think it's a little unfair, but I will continue my question if it's okay. So we're researching these nuclear sites. And just one comment, during the USSR, it wasn't like closed concrete places all fake cities like in the US. It was actually like human living places, and they brought dogs there and fruits and people to test on them during 40-50 years. There's 2 testing sites, Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, Novaya Zemlya Island in Russia, and one more, I think it was in Central Asia as well. So we are like zooming out a little bit and generally researching closed worlds during the USSR, and one of them is Biosphere 3. But my question to you is, so you talked about, I might be interpreting you, But you said that any kind of modeling and any kind of mapping is a reduction of the complexity of the systems. And here I thought about Anna Finks and Donna Haraway's work on multi-species. And my question to you, Lydia, is, and to Ed also, what do you think about creating not only spatial but temporal kind of landscape, maybe mapping, maybe atlas, the land yes, I'm just curious about how would you draw a multi-species map, non-linear maybe, yeah.
I'll be very brief. I think Ed has a lot of thoughts on it, so I'll just say very quickly, and then Ed will follow with more beautiful insights. I don't think that every kind of mapping is reductive. I think that the mapping that we currently use in environmental representation is deductive because it uses certain kinds of processes that are linear, like arrows and flowcharts. So I think there are ways to use representation to show different things, and I believe in the power of representation. I want to say that the multi-species question is extremely popular today. It's almost like all my students and all the discussion about ecological questions these days is about multi-species, and multi-species is kind of connected to questions of ecofeminism and queering ecology and understanding the kind of decentralizing from the human canon. So it's, if we use words like multiple species, care, and all of that, we're definitely in the right zone. But we don't know what this means yet. All that we know is that the world has changed by another. It's not a species, right? It's a entity, the virus, which is another. It's not a species necessarily, but it's another kind of, let's say, organic entity, microorganism. So we can think of organisms. Not all of species have agency and insights, right? Some of them just exist as part of a soup. And I think I don't have any particular direction on how to represent multi-species. I mean, I have a lot of drawings from my students that have tried that, and they draw that all of these other entities and so forth. But it's a very tricky subject of how to move from the deduction of an arrow to the multivalence, let's say, of a cosmic constellation of all of these species. And it doesn't mean that if you put all of them like in a cosmic soup, it's a more meaningful way of representation, because a representation is also something that has resonance with an audience. And that is very important. I mean, we all critique the blue marble image and the kind of Earthrise and these like images that have objectified the earth, but at the same time, they're the most received and celebrated images in mankind that mankind has used. So I think it's a complex question, because representation is not just what we show, right? It's what becomes communicable and digestible from others as well. So I think that that's the real question, like how we become less deductive, but retain a kind of agency to communicate ideas as well.
That links to something that I was thinking of also, Lydia, when I was taking notes last night before your talk. I was thinking of questions and what it would mean to think of closed systems at different timescales. And Dana, this can link, I think, to the issues that you brought up. Is a system closed for a day or a year or a century? And if a system is isolated or partly isolated, And certain kinds of energy flows can move from outside the system to inside or vice versa, or information can move from outside to inside, inside to outside, but energy can't. Then how do we situate our ways of thinking about the limits of the system, or a design response, or a design intentionality at all? I keep going back to this book, this recent book by Daniel Oberhaus called Extraterrestrial Languages. And this dovetails with some conversations that we'll probably have tomorrow with Ben Goertzel and next week with Peter Watts for sure. But it links to what we're talking about now in terms of models and representation. Because if you're familiar at all with some of the problems around designing for communication with CETI, you know that one concept that comes up frequently is the idea of a self-interpreting language or a self-interpreting information system. So basically, like, if you're going to send a message to some alien and you have no idea what their mind is like, what linguistic systems they might have, whether they live in a planet that even has anything that's hard, so they wouldn't have the faintest idea of what, you know, a hard object is, like we do very clearly, et cetera, et cetera. How do you design a system which draws on certain universals? People tend to think math is a universal, but Stephen Wolfram very convincingly argues that math is a human construct almost completely, and you need to go beyond math, or as he puts it, below math. So where do you build a kind of a self-interpreting system? But anyway, you find some universal and you try to say, let's start with the universal, let's represent that universal and abstract it in such a way that some really radically alien mind would recognize the universal and then recognize that some other alien system, us, had tried to abstract that universal and then build a self-interpreting system that started with the most simple and fundamental universal and then built it up. Now, in a funny way, this is what we're always doing when we build models. But I want to link this back to the time frame question that you raised, because for me, that's really fascinating, and has been so for many years. How do you situate design in relationship to multiple timescales? Because on a certain level, you know, like, I really love Aldo Rossi's scientific autobiography. And I remember saying this to certain people over the years, and certain people looking at me and like doing a double take, like, you, what? Oh, you love Rossi's scientific autobiography. Some people were nonplussed by that, and some people, there was an instant like psychic connection to them, and we suddenly shared something. But I love Rossi's scientific autobiography because Rossi is talking about this like radical interiority of human experience, which then gets connected through architecture and through cities to other systems, but at different timescales. You know, and so for Rossi, like the kind of shade of light and the sound inside a hotel room behind a certain kind of balcony in a certain place in Italy is a universe unto itself. And that might have only lasted a few minutes. I mean, he starts the book off talking by, you know, recuperating from a horrible car accident and, you know, shattered bones and the importance of bones then in his work, et cetera, et cetera. Another kind of radical interiority. But for Rossi, you know, that moment I always felt could be just a moment, a very brief moment that then would be expanded or projected or distended out through the architecture in such a way that, as like a codec would work, it would communicate to other agents, other subjects. And so in a funny way, maybe this isn't an obvious connection, but for me, it does get linked back to the question of designing a self-interpreting code that you would use to communicate with dolphins, you know, or aliens. And that links inexorably to the time question for me, because it's partly a question about communication, and it's partly a question of guaranteeing something like a future. Like, you know, I use the example, the bonfire in the forest versus the hut, you know, and it's the Logier. We can invoke Logier, we can invoke Banham. Fernandez Galeano has written about this really beautifully in his book, Fire and Memory. If you burn the wood instead of building a hut, the architect might often say you didn't do anything architectural, but Fernandez Galeano makes the argument that you actually did something very architectural by burning the wood. You know, it just operated at a different time frame. It created the heat locally there for a very brief moment. You know, it didn't leave an artifact for the next person wandering in the forest to take shelter under, which is a different kind of architectural experience, which captures a moment and projects it forward, but in a different way. And so I feel like, Dana, maybe one of the ways that I approach that question of time would be, you know, what are all the timescales that are embedded in any given system that you're looking at? that are already operational or that are latent? And which ones do you want to link the design to? So, again, Lydia, when reading your Closed Worlds book, that's one of the things that's always bouncing around in the back of my head is which timeframes in each of these case studies were the designers actually connecting to? Were they either figuring out were there and then operationalizing them? Or maybe they actually, as designers, they wanted to de-operationalize certain time scales and certain kinds of systems that operated at certain time scales. And so, Dana, I don't know if this is really taking up the points that you brought up, but for me, that question of at what scale of time any system already operates at or already lives in, it isn't just one time scale. It's not just, the 75 to 100 years of the human life. It's like myriad time scales that any human life is an envelope for, would then be the starting point to ask the question, how do we link these all together? And then in terms of designing for what possible futures and also designing for what possible pasts. I mean, maybe design exhumes or resurrects or rebirths a whole series of pasts that we haven't had access to. So hopefully that kind of riffs on what you were bringing up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm going to check all these references. And I would like to maybe write a follow-up email to you if possible. Thank you so much, Lydia, as well.
We have Eugene as well, who's raised his hand.
Hi, Eugene. We can't hear you.
We can see you.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Excuse me.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Lydia, thank you once again for your lecture. I definitely want to read more of the book, but I'd like to investigate what you shared from another part of the spectrum. So do you think that your understanding of closure provide us with a broader framework of defining open systems? Could there be different kinds of openness in a sense? And if yes, in which ways can we explore this multiplicity of openness?
Thank you, Eugene. That's an excellent question. And I think that one of the things that the term closed worlds is a kind of provocation, right? It does not in any way promote the idea of closure as a kind of model to be reproduced or thought of, but also makes evident that there is no such thing as a closed world, or possibly that we have, as a kind of species, a desire to construct it in order to control, calibrate, and monitor certain incidents, certain lived environments, certain spaces, certain experiments. But there is no such thing. So I think that one of the provocations of, I mean, this is an overgeneralization also, but one of the intentions were to make evident that closure is an ideological construct and not a kind of part of the world that we live in. So I think that this is something important that I haven't actually put into words as literally as I'm saying it right now, but it's important to distinguish, and also to say that, you know, there have been, you know, a professor of mine from Princeton, former professor, obviously, she said, well, you should have been more specific with what you mean by closure, because you jump from material closure to cybernetic closure to ideological closure to this, and that kind of transference is kind of a poetic license that is too liberal in her view. And even though I agree with her comment, and it is definitely a point of critique in not being an epistemological critique or a methodological critique of what could have been the choice of the term. I really I really think that thinking of closure in different terms in parallel is much more productive than just from one side. That if you only think of closure as a material system, like not exchanging matter and energy with its environment. But I think that it's very interesting to see the kind of effects that are produced in byproducts of material closure. Is there a social closure as a byproduct effect of this? And to kind of examine these aspects as parallel. So that was an intention that we can discuss, but I was intent on conflating and kind of collapsing these aspects. Does that answer your question, Eugene?
I guess, yeah, partially, but I probably would formulate some other aspects of that later in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. I think we're close to the end of the session, and I don't see any other hands jumping up. I see Dana saying that we'd like to discuss more if possible. That's good. Let's do that outside the limits of today's talk. Lydia, thank you so much. Do you want to have any kind of closing comments, Lydia? Jimmy? Fred?
I just want to thank you and Fred and Jimmy for the invitation and for your really poignant observations. Like, I took notes that here they are. I took notes and I'm going to use them in my next article. So thank you very much.
Me too. Thank
for
you.
all the questions.
Thank you for the beautiful work, Fred. Are you still here, Fred? Thank you so much for joining, Fred.
Thanks, y'all. I took notes too. I have extra file here. I can't show them.
Cool. All right, everybody. Well then, Lydia, again, a million thanks. And Jimmy, thank you for helping with the session and with upcoming sessions that you're going to put together over the summer. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Will. And just a reminder, tomorrow we are going to do another session at 1 p.m. with Ben Goertzel, the AI developer, the renowned AI developer and cosmist and philosopher and mathematician. And so I'm sure that will be a really cool session as well. So thanks, everybody. Try to drop in tomorrow if you can.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Okay. Bye, Lydia. Thanks again.